Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, coming to you from the central part of California, where we're hoping for more rain tomorrow. We're loving the rain this year. And I'm the author of about 45 books, and most of them are novels and some nonfiction.
And I'm Molly Jo Riley, producer of the podcast Social Media Ninja for Aaron and a few other people. I am the author collaborator for the Unemployment Cookbook and currently work in progress, the location mystery NOLA.
And just a quick reminder to those of you listening to the audio broadcast, if you're ever home online at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, you can watch us live on YouTube or at aarongansky.com. If you want to know how to get those notifications, you can add Firsts in Fiction Podcast at gmail.com to your Google Plus, and I always send out an invitation to everybody who's connected to my circles, people who are in my circles. I think that's what it is with Google Plus. So
Yes.
Be in my circle, and that way you'll get the notifications. So if you do not recognize us tonight, there is a good reason for that, and it's because we are on time. We are knocking on wood that there will be no technical difficulties tonight, but there were none beforehand, so that's unusual, and we're excited about that. So we're going to jump right into the cast today with our Ask the Author feature, which is a new feature that we've started this year, and so far I'm really enjoying it. So we take a question that has been asked to us, and then each of us take a turn answering it. So today's question comes from Jacob Sorensen, who asks, what are some things that separate an amateur tale from a captivating story people love? And for me, it really is an issue of how much the author trusts the reader. Most amateur writers don't trust the reader, so they end up overwriting. They try and rely on gimmicks and cliches to try and kind of keep things moving. Kind of these cheesy little cliffhanger type endings, not to really make things exciting, but just because they're afraid that their writing is not strong enough to keep the attention of the reader. So for me, what marks a professional manuscript is somebody who trusts their own writing, somebody who handles things with a certain amount of subtlety. They shy away from sensationalism, trying to make everything over the top, and they kind of have this kind of a subdued kind of a tale. And that's a beautiful thing when an author trusts their reader and they can write simply what they want to write rather than having to kind of hang neon signs and bright flashing things. What I sometimes call crowbar fiction, which is where it just beats you over the head with an idea rather than simply letting you discover it on your own. And so that for me is really one of the demarcation lines, is how much are you relying on gimmicks and cliches and sensationalism to make your point rather than simply letting the point make itself. That's what I would say. How about you, Pops?
I was going to be snide and say my name on the cover would separate the two, but
Now, would that be for an amateur book or for a professional?
well, I was saying for the professional, but I see that I left myself open for that. But I'm not going to say that because not everybody knows me and won't realize that I'm probably one of the more insecure writers out there. For me, it's clarity over clutter. One of the problems I see with amateur writing is they love the idea of being a writer more than they love the idea of doing the writing, doing the work. And so they try to sound like some writer. They want to be Hemingway, or they want to sound like Fitzgerald or someone else. And so they end up writing in a voice that isn't theirs. Clarity over clutter, and by that I mean you get to the point, you take out the stuff that you don't need. The best stories are those where you can tell the author loved the story, and the story is paramount and matters more than anything, even more than the writer. And then I also like a plot line and characters that connect to me, that I can relate to, and that will haunt me when the book's over. When I turn the last page on the book, I want to think, man, I could go for another 25 pages of this. So to me, that's the difference, really. Somebody that's honored the story and given their best in the writing of it in their own voice, not trying to sound like someone else.
Absolutely. How about you, Molly?
For me, I think it's an issue of understanding that amateur writing is not the same as being a new writer. Amateur for me is the opposite of professional, and you could have been writing for 10 or 15 years and still be amateur at it. It's the quality of writing, the quality of the amount of effort that you put into the book. And as an editor, I tend to, not intentionally, but I just tend to naturally pick apart books or anything I'm reading, or even if watching a movie on TV or something like that. So it's the quality of, you can tell if somebody's put in a lot of effort, if they're just trying to tell a story, or if they're really trying to make it better writing. And that's generally what I tend to notice, is how many punctuation errors are there. Does this flow well? Does this not flow well? Like you guys were both saying about the plot, the characters, are they well developed? And that's all part and parcel for developing a thorough story. But for me, it's also the simple things of, did they take time enough to really research the punctuation or the setting, or things that on the surface people sometimes gloss over?
Well, I want to throw something in here about punctuation. Punctuation varies from publisher to publisher. When we're in school, we're taught there's one way to punctuate, and that isn't really the case. I've got grammar books over here that say never use a semicolon this way, and the next book to it says always use a semicolon this way. So they can't all be right. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it has to do with what we were taught in school, which isn't really true. Ending a sentence in a preposition is fine in English. In Latin, it's not. But for those who studied Latin, somehow it became part of what we were taught in school, so now you don't do that. And then also, editors will change punctuation of a writer. If you're going through a traditional, a legacy publisher, mm-hmm. then they will often change punctuation, sometimes even to a way that you don't like. And among them, I just throw a quick story in here. I did one for a big publisher, and they, I had 3 copy editors. And the first copy editor went through it and changed a bunch of stuff. And the second copy editor went through it and changed everything the first editor did and changed it back to the way I had it. And the third one came through and changed both of them, and there was an argument between the 3 of them about what was right. Finally, they settled on something with that. So, yeah, you want to be as right as you can be. But even if you remember my old math, if you write 100,000 words and you're 99% correct, you've got 1,000 mistakes in your book. So if you're 99.9%, 99.9%, you still got 100. And so that's why if we're fortunate, we get very good editors and multiple editors. I'm always more comfortable when there's 2 or 3 copy editors.
Yeah, I had an editor that went through and added exclamation points into my writing. I remember going through, like, I don't remember putting an exclamation point here. And so there sometimes is that. But I think kind of, Molly, what you're touching on is, I saw this at the Citron Review, people would send in things that clearly had, I mean, they just hadn't even bothered to hit the spell check on Microsoft Word before they sent it in. And my wife has actually purchased some self-published books and found just a litany of errors. Not, I mean, a comma splice, one thing, a semicolon here or there, is not a big deal, but when we're talking, when it compromises the clarity, Pops, one of the things you're talking about, clarity, mm-hmm. When the writing is just so stilted, I think that can be also a tale of an amateur. Somebody who's so eager to get their story out that they don't bother to make sure the story is right.
Exactly. It's the overall presentation, and you hit the nail on the head again. It's how soon do they want to be published, as opposed to do they want to take the time to make sure it's presentable. And unfortunately, I hate to say it because I'm self-published, but that is what gives self-publishing a bad name, are these people that are too eager to be published instead of waiting to put out a good book.
This idea that they'd rather be published than write, or they'd rather be published than good, and that's always a fine line to walk. When do you know if your manuscript is good enough to send out, and when do you think it needs more polish? But a true writer, a professional writer, is going to make sure that their product is polished before they send it out into the world. And Pops, you mentioned something else about basically something that starts strong, something that ends strong. Really, really appreciate that. From my old days in the band, your best song had to be your two best songs had to be your opening and your closing, because that's what's going to get the reader's attention. And Pops, you mentioned when you get to that last chapter, you want to be able to close the book and go, I could use a little bit more, just to kind of have them wanting a little bit, because then they're going to buy your next book. And so somebody who understands the ebb and the flow of a story, that the ups and the downs, and riding the waves, and how to control that. And more importantly than anything else, a writer who can get out of the way of the story, let the story tell itself in the cleanest way possible. So those are fantastic answers. You guys are smart.
I read a book once.
Oh yeah, all of it, or just?
On the typos, and Aaron, I know you know this, but I always make typos, and my typos make sense. Not in the story; they just make sense, and sometimes they're absolutely hilarious and very embarrassing for me. But a lot of people don't realize this, that rare book dealers, one of the ways that they judge a first edition, first edition, because you could have more than one first edition, other printings, but a first run, first edition, first printing, is they know where the typos are. And that's what they'll do, is they'll turn to those pages. They'll go on page 36, third line down. They use the word to, T-O-O, when they really mean T-O. And they go and they find it, and if it's been corrected, they know it's not a first edition.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I always put a few mistakes in mind, just to help those guys out. They're hardworking folks, so.
Yeah.
That's really nice of you.
Yeah.
Super benevolent. So I've got to share this story real quick. I was texting an old student of mine who was asking for some advice, and I mentioned to him that my very lovely and very wise wife suggested one thing. And he wrote back and said, I'm going to assume that you meant your wise wife, and had it all in caps. And I went, well, what did I type? Apparently I had typed my very lovely and wide wife.
Oh my.
And I'm so glad Naomi's not reading my text messaging right now. That's so embarrassing. I told her about it, and she laughed. That's what I love about my wife. She laughs about it. So
I've made those mistakes, and even more embarrassing ones than that.
Yeah. What it's
I
about
one where I was describing a upscale office in Seattle, and one wall was all windows on the top floor, and I was talking about the size of the window, but what I ended up writing was the widow was enormous, reaching from floor to ceiling and wall to wall, which is perhaps one of the largest grieving women anyone would ever encounter.
I guess so.
Fortunately, that one got caught, as have some of my many others. And the one that Aaron caught. Aaron, you caught one of mine.
Yeah.
In one of the soldier books, that a guy had been shot, and the medic says, I'm afraid he has eternal injuries. Not only you hurt, pal, but it's going to be like this forever.
Forever. How do you fix
internal, not eternal.
Gosh.
Yeah. And it almost makes sense, too. I mean, if it was a fantasy novel, it's an eternal injury. So
you got decades and stuff with this.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Well, we were talking about selecting and refining your ideas tonight. I guess we should, at some point, transition into the actual topic. But we've got plenty of time. We started on time tonight, so we've got loads of time, right? I mean,
what's really hilarious is I put in the chat room that, hey, we're going to start on time, and Maya's in the chat room, and she says, don't ever say that before you go live. And then 10 minutes later, she's having tech issues on her end. So.
Oh, no. It had to happen to somebody.
Sorry, Maya, but we're glad that you're back in the chat room now.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the bullet for our tech issues. So. We're talking about selecting and refining your ideas tonight. Last week we talked about brainstorming ideas, where to come up with them, how to flesh them out a little bit. So now we're going to assume that you've done that you've got a kind of an idea bank, that you've put together 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 24 different ideas, workable ideas. You've brainstormed on a few of them, and now you're kind of at that point where you think, which one do I write? How do I know which one's the right one? And really that boils down to the question, what do you want to write? And I think the first question that we come up against is, are you looking to write a novel, or are you looking to write short fiction? How do you know if your story idea is going to be a short story or a novella or a novel? And there's a few ways to kind of discern that. The first thing that you want to do is kind of approximate how many pages it's going to take you to tell the story? Do you have several plot lines that you're trying to weave together? If so, you're looking at a novel. If you only have one central conflict, you're probably writing a short story. The example here I would use is that a husband and a wife are reconciling. That's probably a short story. You've got two characters, you've got a central conflict, you've got a motivation, they're trying to reconcile their marriage. Now, a second example, and this actually comes from the novel Remember Me Like This by Bret Anthony Johnston, and I've been slacking off lately, and I haven't mentioned his name in weeks, and normally I mention it 3 or 4 times a week, so trying to get my numbers back up. So Bret Anthony Johnston, fantastic writer, he wrote a novel called Remember Me Like This, in which a family is trying to rebuild itself after their son has been returned after being abducted for a number of years. And it's really intriguing that the novel starts with the son's return, and it's really about how the family had kind of fallen apart and how they're trying to work back together. And now, because of that, he's got several characters. He's got mom, he's got dad, he's got the son, he's got the little brother, and their individual relationships with not only each other, but with other people outside of the family, how the town reacts to it, the grandfather, these types of things. Now, that's a lot of different stories kind of going on because you have so many characters. So if you've got a large cast of characters and you've got a large ball of conflict yarn that you've plot lines weaving together, you're probably going to end up with a novel. And if you want it to be a novel, great. If you don't, you're probably going to have to start trimming some of those ideas back.
Yeah, agreed. Sorry for the silence there. Somebody was calling in, and I was declining the call and trying to figure out what to do next. Just hang up on them. That's my approach. Determining length, of course, is always difficult. Usually we want the story to determine the length, but I think you're spot on when you're talking about the difference between a short story and book length work. And I had an idea that I just dearly loved, but I had to hold on to it for, really years, because it had just one crisis point in it. It was just one problem in the whole thing, and I had to just wait, and somebody called and asked me to do some flash fiction. It's really a little longer than flash fiction, but if I'd write a short story for him, and that story was just fit the bill, so that's what I wrote. I think I called it 1957 or something, and when I finally got it down to the right size, I realized that's really all the story was worth. It wasn't worth any more pages than that, and it did its job. It's difficult to guess how many you're going to have in your novel, but you can take a shot at it. I normally aim in a novel for about 350 manuscript pages, but maybe 400, unless I'm doing something of more epic. I don't do fantasy writing, but if I did, that could run a lot longer. But really what drives that is how much is it going to cost to make the book, unless they're going to go ebook only. And so with a new writer, they usually want it shorter. And so for suspense, thriller, most crime novels and stuff are going to be about 350 pages. Romances, westerns are usually a little shorter. Cozy mysteries are shorter. Sometimes fantasies run longer. And because the fantasy market will tolerate that, they like a long book. Thriller writers don't necessarily want a long book. Horror can, Stephen King cranks out 800 pages. So.
But he's Stephen King, so.
He's Stephen King.
Well, yeah, and he was affected by it with The Stand. They really reduced his book. If you get a first edition of The Stand, it's like a third of the regular book. Mm-hmm. And when he became famous and was selling tons and tons of books, he then had the weight, the cachet to say, I want to publish this, and I want to publish it in its full length, and they figured they could sell a book of that length. And I think that's his longest book. I forget what it is, 1,200 pages.
I think
so.
It is long.
Yeah.
It is long for sure. The Wheel of Time series, who Brandon Sanderson finished it up, but before that it was Robert Jordan. It's 14 books long. The shortest one is 998 pages.
Sure. Oh my goodness.
is, and again, the fantasy genre, especially epic fantasy, I don't know what it is about fantasy readers. I think at some point they figure they want to get their money's worth, so just give me lots of pages. But they fall in love with the setting, and they fall in love with the characters, and they want lots of characters, and they want lots of plot lines, and they want lots of different settings, and traveling, and magic, and mystery. They want all of it, romance. They kind of want everything kind of woven together. And so if you're looking at, I guess one thing that we should say here is, what genre are you writing for? You need to know your audience. What are your audience's expectations? I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But in the process of your brainstorming, these are questions you should ask. How many conflicts do I have? How many characters do I have? How many settings am I going to have? Is it all going to be in the same location, or is it going to be in different locations, different cities? Is this going to be kind of a globe-trotting adventure? You have to figure that for every character, every conflict, every setting that you add, you're adding quite a few pages. I can't give you a number, but you're probably going to add, for a character, you're probably adding 50 pages. If you're adding a setting, you're probably adding 20 to 25 pages. These are just rough numbers off the top of my head, but this is the amount of time that you're going to have to take to adequately build these to a point where they're satisfactory to your audience. And I mean, I'm not talking about auxiliary characters, the waiter who brings the coffee. We don't need extra pages for them, but yeah,
no, I'm sorry. Anybody who brings coffee, you need to expand that character.
Okay, all right. They have a vital role in the story, which is
okay. I want that clarified.
There's a shortage of coffee beans.
Coffee.
What do we do? But for the most part, auxiliary characters that serve only to advance the plot. I think I'm talking more about point of view characters here, protagonists, antagonists, close
supporting. No.
Yes, supporting characters. Those are adding a lot of pages. So one of the things
when we talk about you're going to have to add pages for scenes. That's especially true in fantasy because you're doing a lot of world building. But that's spread out through much of the novel, through Act 1 and 2, and any time a new scene comes in. We're not saying you're going to add 24 pages all in one chunk about a particular scene, not unless you're writing in the 1870s or something. Not about the 1870s. I mean, you go back in time and begin to write. It's just not modern writing. That's not done, but that does get spaced out over time.
Thank you for that. Yeah. That is a good point, and thanks for making that clear. Yeah, not 24 pages all at one clump. It's spread out, but every time you come back to that scene, you've got to set it again. That setting, you have to set it again. For me, and this is one of the things that I've found true in my writing, especially as an amateur writer early on, is that I found myself in the great in-between. My first novel actually began as a short story of about 20 pages, and then I rewrote it, and it was 25, and then it was 35, then it was 50. I remember getting to 50 thinking, I've got to make a choice here. This is either too long, because it's too long to sell as a short story, and it's too short to sell as a novel. So I needed to make a choice, and I decided to kind of ramp it up a little bit and turn it into a novel. Now, I will say that the novel was not good by any stretch of the imagination, but I finished it, and I learned a lot in the process. I learned about a lot of what not to do and what works for me, what doesn't work for me. So it served a purpose, but it was kind of caught in that great in-between. And actually, the bargain, if I can be completely transparent with our audience here, was also in the great in-between. I had a single cohesive narrative that I thought could bridge the gap between several of the short stories I had written. And quite honestly, I had written the one novel, but I wasn't sure that I could do another one. And how am I going to fill up 350 pages? And I thought, well, all these stories take place in the same location. I could probably develop that. And so I came up with kind of this idea that wove them all together. Did a lot of work to make it, readable, but it was one of those books that was caught in the great in-between, and I had to find some way to put it all together. And so that's one of the things that you'll need to look at with your story. Is it short? Is it long? If it's in the in-between, you're going to have to find a way. Add some characters, add some settings, add some plot lines, or take some out. And I would say don't be afraid to take stuff out. One of the short stories of the chapters in the bargain was actually going to be a novel on its own. And I started doing some work on it, and then I realized that I was having to pull teeth to get it to where it needed to be a novel, and I realized that the heart of the story was actually not 25, 30, 40, 50 pages. It was actually about 15. And so I whittled that down. Kind of an interesting story that not a lot of people know. I actually tweeted that short story out years ago, and just sentence by sentence, tweet by tweet, 140 characters or less. You want to talk about an exercise in editing? You've got a sentence that's 160 characters, and you want to get the whole sentence out, you find ways to cut words. And so that was actually a lot of fun. And when you've got nothing but time, I encourage you, try that out. Take one of your short stories and see if you can tweet it out and get some followers, and practice your cutting. Practice cutting your darlings. There were a lot of darlings that were murdered in that process.
I'll add just one thing here. When we talk about 24 pages throughout the book of scenes, they don't always run that long. I've got this fear as I'm sitting over here now thinking people are saying, wait a minute, I got to have 24 pages to describe one scene? No. Describe it in a way that needs to be done and that serves the story. Don't do too much page counting other than to think about the readership and what's good for that genre. My third book, my second book, although I wrote it third, it came out of order with that. I had to take 3 out of every 5 pages out.
Ouch.
Oh, that was horrible. And I made a hash on the first pass. It may not have been a great book to begin with, but I made sure it wasn't great by the time I did that first reduction on the thing. And you really don't want to have to do that. So try to get an idea for what's typical for that genre when you're starting out and write for it. After you've done that, and you're making headway and people trust you and you're moving enough books, you can go longer if it's appropriate for the genre and for your story.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you're bringing up a good point here that we've kind of touched on, and that's keeping your reader in mind. And we've done some podcasts on this before about understanding who it is that you're writing for. Stephen King talks about his ideal reader, and what his ideal reader looks like and what they want in a story, and how he can, how his story is going to meet those expectations. We need to do the same thing. The story needs an audience. Now, I'm the one who generally says, write whatever story you want, and you can find the audience. But I was having a conversation with one of my students today, and I said, who are you writing for? What's your audience look like? And he's kind of like, well, it's, this is what we all do as writers. Well, it's for everybody from the ages of 4 till death, and male and female across all ethnicities and genres and genders and nationalities and creeds and religion. Okay, you're writing for the whole world, but by writing for everybody, you end up writing for no one. And so you want to know who it is that's going to read your book. And I said, what other books has your target audience read? Well, I've taken an element of this and this and this and this and this. And what I was trying to explain to him is that he's trying to take these very disparate audiences from different points in the globe and readership and try and find a story that fits them all. And I said, I think what you're doing is you're now writing for an audience of 6, who have played all the games that you've talked about and read all the books that you've talked about. I said, when I think of your story as he described it to me, I said, these are the 2 major influences that I see, and I think that's kind of the audience you should go after. So write the story that you love. You can find the audience later, but you have to understand that if you've got an audience of 4, you're probably not selling much more than 4 books. And so think that through. What does your audience look like? What are their expectations? What are their genre? What genres are they looking for? What conventions are they expecting to see? Which of these are going to, what parts of your story are going to conform to their expectations? What parts of your story are going to challenge their expectations? I'm not saying you have to follow every single rule of the genre, but you have to follow most of them. And the ones that you challenge, you're going to have to do that deliberately, intentionally, in such a way as not to alienate your readers. So as you're thinking of your ideas and trying to flesh those out, You got to keep that in mind. Who's reading this book, and what are their expectations? What do they want to see?
Good advice. I like that.
Thanks. How about you, Pops?
Yeah, there's some good comments in that, and this again is something that's learned. And really, what you're talking about again is when you're thinking about your audience, you're not thinking about yourself. It's okay to sit back and say, I want to be a full-time writer. I did that for years, and I still do it. I'm still making decisions that are trying to keep me as a full-time writer. But the best material that I've turned out have been those things when I didn't matter, but the story did. And then I will have all the fun and stuff after it's done, but what really matters is the story and who's going to be reading it. And if I keep that in mind, then I do better work. So that's always something to keep in mind as you're selecting your ideas. You've brainstormed. Now we come to this part where you're going to start selecting. You're narrowing them down. And does any one of the ideas or two or three of the ideas seem more saleable? Is there an audience for them? And then I think there's this thing called the percolation process. It percolates like the old coffee pots used to percolate. Ideas seldom arrive fully formed in our minds. We can sometimes get a very clear idea of where we're going to go with that, but a good story is more of a seductress. It pulls you in. And that whole idea of the story needs to marinate in the mind. It needs to just stay there until it becomes a part of you, and you can't get rid of it. And that's how you determine the more meaningful stories to you. So let's say you came up with 10 story ideas, but these top 4, boy, those kind of ring my bell. And now I've been thinking about who's going to read them, and I think the other 3 have a better chance of being placed and published, a stronger readership. But then as I think about these things, one begins to take over. It elbows out all the others. And the more I think about it, the more part of me it becomes, and the more I become a part of it. And that's how I know this is the idea that is ripe for its time. And I keep the others in mind, but if they can't step up at that point, then I set them aside for later.
I'm reminded of Slaughterhouse-Five when Billy Pilgrim goes on the radio and talks about how the Tralfamadorians have abducted him, and they see time in 5 dimensions and whatever else it is, and just this absurd tale. And his daughter calls him on it. Why didn't you say any of this earlier? And he says, because the time wasn't ripe. I don't know why I love that so much, but I think you're right, Pops. You make a good point. The idea sometimes, as you start to work on it, you might find it's still a little tough. It's not quite ready to go. It might need to stay on the vine for a little bit and finish ripening, a little more time in the sun, a few more nutrients. Time can't hurt something. The worst that can happen is you forget the idea, but I'd also say if you forget the idea, maybe it wasn't meant to be in the first place. It's those ideas that really stick with you.
That's right. It's not haunting you, yeah.
Yeah. And Pops, you've put here in the show notes, I like the way you say this, does the idea get you in the gut? And I think the ideas that are getting us in the gut, those are the ones that stick with us, that don't go away. Even sometimes when we want them to, I wish this idea would just go away, but it keeps coming back and plaguing you, and because I think perhaps it gets you in the gut. So Pops, when you say, does the idea get you in the gut, what are you talking about there?
Well, creative people can come up with lots of ideas. It just doesn't mean it's their idea, an idea that's for them. And I throw away ideas like I throw away trash. It's just not right for me, but the next person may write it, and it'll be absolutely wonderful. The key is there an emotive connection between you and your story? Do you love your story enough that you want to live with it day in, day out, sometimes many hours at a time, to bring this thing to life? Especially for male writers, it's the closest thing we can come to being pregnant. There's going to be a process, there's going to be development, and it's going to take time, and to be committed to that. And the ideas that get you in the gut, because you have an emotional response to it. And this happens to me all the time. I've had an idea that jumped back up in my life today. And it was an idea I had years ago, and I thought that'd be a great story, but it was just never quite right. And then it popped up today. Is it still right, or is it right now? I don't know. It's only been today, so I'm going to let it percolate a little bit more. But it kind of rang my bell. I thought, that might be what I need. And then I saw an aspect in it I hadn't seen before, and that may have been what I'm waiting on. That's why you let these things percolate, and then you make sure that it hits you in the gut. Because if it doesn't hit you in the gut, it's not going to hit your readers in the gut.
Well said. If you're not feeling it, the reader won't either. And I like the analogy you have of the closest men can get to being pregnant. I mean, sometimes you feel these ideas kicking, right? And your back starts to hurt when you're sitting down for so long and working on it at the computer, and the fatigue, and
stop it.
I'm extending the analogy here. This is an extended metaphor.
Yeah, but you realize that all the women listening are like rolling our eyes and being like, yeah, right.
I mean, how hard can it be, right? It's just childbirth, all right?
Okay.
At this point, I want to distance myself from my son.
I appreciate the analogy, but
Too far?
Yeah.
Too far? Whenever I want to know where the line is, I just look behind me. So
that's
normally where it is.
Good practice for you.
Yeah, but I like what you're saying though, Pops. It does have to get you in the gut. Sometimes these things are not. It's not their time. And one thing that you said that I'd like to touch on, you said that you realized an aspect recently of an idea that you hadn't before. And I think sometimes that comes from not just letting the idea sit on the vine for a while, but it also comes from coming up with other ideas. So you might come up with the first half of an idea and later on come up with the second half. And sometimes your idea is waiting for its partner. I talk a lot about getting great ideas from taking great works of art and putting them together. I always say that Twilight is Romeo and Juliet with fangs. There are lots of books that you can take. It's X plus Y. It's Harry Potter under the sea. I don't know what that looks like, but taking these disparate ideas and finding a way to kind of combine them can usually produce some pretty outstanding fiction. I will say the Eragon series got a lot of heat, the first book, Eragon. A lot of people really complained, oh, it's just Star Wars with dragons. And I thought, well, I like Star Wars and I like dragons, so why wouldn't I read this book? Like, that's beautiful. And so I read the book, and I enjoyed the first one. The first one was good. We'll just move on. But sometimes it's just finding the partner idea. And that's not something that's in our notes. I'll try and add that in our notes. But while you're waiting, while you're percolating, sometimes it's just looking for that complementary idea. What other ideas do you have that complement each other? Go back to your idea bank and look at some of them that have been kind of collecting dust for a while. Is there a way to combine them to make something exciting and new and extravagant? And how would you go about doing that? So don't be afraid to take some time and let an idea develop some. Yeah, Pops, what moves you about the idea? That's another question you suggest asking.
Yeah, again, we go back to this thing, if it doesn't move you, it won't move your readers, and that's certainly the case. You need to be emotionally involved with the story. I've long said your writing should make you cry, it should make you laugh, chortle, worry, be depressed, because if it's not doing that to you, it's not going to do that to your reader.
Mm-hmm.
And I have written myself into tears. I'm not normally a very demonstrative man, getting more that way as I get older, I guess. But I've written myself into tears. I've had great chuckles with my characters, because some of my characters are just extremely funny. I love the guys. And that's really the other thing is I think some of the best writers, if you ask them if they know the difference between fiction and reality, they'll tell you yes, but I suspect that they don't. And that often those characters are very, very real. I sometimes miss my characters. Well, I spend so much time with them, so I have to make them real to me. So does my idea carry the kind of characters that will come across as real? Will my readers feel the same emotions? The bad guys, will they see that what a jerk he is? Will they also be frightened by him? Can I get that kind of thing across? So in choosing the ideas, I usually choose those that allow that kind of connection to me, and then allows me to write it so that it'll connect to the reader also.
Yeah, I agree, especially about the what you're saying about characters. I've mentioned before that I'm working on the final book in the Hand of Adonai series, and it's one where I've faced a tremendous amount of writer's block. I've never had writer's block like this, and every time I go back to the book, I find something else to do. And I think in part it's because I know that it's the final chapter, and that means that when I write the end, I don't know when I'm going to see my characters again. And it's you know, it's your best friends moving away in a lot of ways. And so if you've got characters that you are really passionate about, or a story that you're really passionate to see, it can be tough to kind of do that. There's the excitement of I want to see how this ends, and then there's that fear of, man, I don't want to say goodbye to these guys, you know. So I think that's one way you can tell when a book is really going, when you've got an idea that's really strong, is when you've got these characters that are just ideas, and you want to see them be born. If we want to continue that theme, we want to see them develop and grow. We want to see them take their first steps, and we want to be a part of that as their characters develop on the page. That's an important thing. Pops, you also mentioned this question: which ideas do you see? And I really like that because you're emphasizing the imagery of the story. Perhaps that's the setting or the characters or whatever the case may be, but Flannery O'Connor talks about a central image in her work that often will become the title for her pieces. What image is it that you see that keeps coming back to you, and what narrative thread will accomplish the development of that image? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize, including new writers, is that writing is a visual medium. We're not making a movie. You know, we can't portray that in every book, but the way we describe scenes, the way we set up scenes, the way we set up characters, the way we describe action becomes very visual, and the reader will see it in their mind. That's why when you do character descriptions, you want to do it fairly early in the book, because if you don't, the reader will fabricate a description of the character, and then if you change it later, they'll say, no, he has blonde hair, he doesn't have dark hair, because I've established it that way. We tend to see these things. Even though we're reading words, the way imagination works is we start painting pictures. So in selecting the idea that you want to work on, is it something that you can help people see? Not just read about, but can they see it? Live vicariously through the writing, be there, see it, sense things, really all of the senses, but they will paint pictures in their mind. They will run a movie in their brain.
I've been reading Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics because I'm that big of a nerd. Fantastic book. Pops, I think you would really appreciate it. Very academic, kind of scholarly look at comic books, but what makes them work. It's like a textbook, but it's told in comic book form. You've got a little narrator, and it's illustrated, and it's fantastic.
That is quite nerdy of you, Aaron.
Oh, stop. I know I'm a nerd. You don't have to remind me. Fantastic. But what he's talking about is he talks about how there's photorealistic art, and then there's my face now is photorealistic. But if somebody were to illustrate me, certain qualities, certain details would be left out. And then if there's a different style of art where there's even less detail, until you get down to a circle with two dots and a line that represents a face. He goes, this is abstraction. And abstraction requires more from the reader because the reader has to use their imagination to fill in the details that aren't there. But of course the ultimate abstraction is a word, face, F-A-C-E. When I write that, it's entirely dependent on the reader to come up with their own idea, their own detailed face that they create. So by stringing these words together, you can kind of give them instructions for their imagination. But a lot of times you don't even have to. They'll throw that out and imagine a different face completely. But they can imagine a face without the word face or eye or some sort of kind of abstraction like that. And so it's interesting. You've got to have the words to trigger their imagination, but their imagination does a lot of work. So that was a complete tangent, by the way.
Well, if your idea has imagery in it, that is, it's prone to it, that makes it a stronger idea. A lot of people may not realize this, but Albert Einstein's real gift wasn't math. He had to hire mathematicians or bring him in from Princeton, where he was teaching. His supernatural skill, his kung fu, was that he could draw pictures in his mind, scenes in his mind, and he would imagine it, and in that setup, he would see the solutions he needed. So when he'd have a problem, he'd be working in his office out of Princeton, and was it Princeton? Was it Princeton? Somebody correct me. Anyway, when he was working at the university, if he came across a problem, he would say, "I will a little tink," is that heavy German accent, and he would sit down and he would begin to paint images in his mind. And the most famous one is the trolley car that goes up to the speed of light. And he imagined himself being on this trolley as it got faster and faster and faster. What would he see, and then what would people see that were looking at him? From that came this revolutionary theory in the 50s. We're doing that as novelists when we're selecting ideas that allow us to set up imagery so that the reader will take what we give them, add to it, color between the lines, to see what we want them to see. And so the best ideas will have that kind of ability. There'll be a great palette upon which to paint.
Oh, I like that. They're going to color within the lines. We need to give them the lines in which they must color, but yes, we do give them the crayons or the paintbrushes if you want to be a little more refined. But yeah, interesting stuff. The other thing that your idea needs, and kind of moving on here as time's ticking away, your story needs to hit on all cylinders. So thinking of the mental aspect, thinking of your character specifically, people have three parts, Pops. You say mental, emotional, and spiritual. Actually, you say they have three
physical,
parts.
Yeah, I should have said 4 parts, yeah.
There are 6 kinds of people in the world, those who can count and those who can't. So mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. And your story should be touching on those at some point. Now, even if you're not writing, a romance, there's still going to be emotional moments. There's going to be fear. There's going to be celebration and joy. There's going to be tragedy. And we've done an entire podcast about the spiritual aspect of characters and physical aspect of characters and mental aspects. So we've got a lot of those in the archive that you can go back and check. But with your story, when you think of your idea, you think of your characters, can you fully imagine them in all 4 aspects of their character? If so, this is an idea that you're going to continue on. This is an idea that's going to kind of separate itself from the rest. It's going to be a little more ready to go. And then I think lastly here, Pop, since our last point is we kind of talked about if your idea is saleable. Did we talk about that?
Yeah, we factored that in. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it going to have a home? Is it going to have the home that you want? You can always find a home. It just takes a lot of work. But the question is, what home do you want it to have? What publisher do you want it to be at? And sometimes there are lots of them that will work, but publishers don't take books that don't fit their market, and so you have to do a lot of market research and things of that nature. So that's another thing to consider. But lastly, the one that I wanted to point out, Pops, and you mentioned this, and you've got an example here for us, but does one question lead you to another question? So how does that work for you, Pops?
Yeah, before I answer that, I want you to know that Tess DeGroot has bailed me out, and he did teach at Princeton.
Yay!
Einstein did teach at Princeton, so it's good to have the safety net there. Thank you, Tess. Yeah, one of the ways I judge ideas is it bring up a whole bunch of questions in my mind. I taught at an Indiana University for a short time. It was a winter course, actually, because it was freezing in between semesters, and I was teaching on how to write the suspense novel. And one of the things I did is I gave them the basics of an idea to see what questions they would bring up and see how that would affect their story. And here's the idea. I don't know if you've ever flown on a little puddle jumper, the small little planes where the pilot has to get out there and pull a starter cord to get the engines going, and people have to push it on. Just really frightening kind of thing to fly on. And I was flying in one of those, and there's only one attendant because they have to keep the weight down. And so there's only one attendant on these small things, and I figure I'm going to be here an hour, hour and a half, so it can't be that bad. But one of the things I noticed was during takeoff and before landing that when the attendant sat down to buckle in, she faced the passengers. Her seat was the door that led to the cockpit, so the door would be closed, and she would lower her seat, she'd sit down, and then she would be looking at a plane full of people. And so, of course, being the kind of writer that I am, the first question I had was, if we started going down, what would she see?
That's awful.
Yeah, it's a horrible thought. But I write suspense and supernatural suspense, so that was my first thought. I said, what would she see? She can't get up and do anything, so she'd be looking at our faces. And so the question to those students and to those listening today is this. The plane is going down. She's strapped in like everyone else. There's panic. There's screaming, except one guy who's just as comfortable as can be and continues to read his magazine like there's no problem.
Mm.
All right. Where does that story go? And the idea is that will start generating questions. Who is that guy? Is there something about the magazine? Is he supernatural? Is he stupid? Does he not know that we're going? What's going on? And then I added a little later in another class, I added this. The attendant lives. Of course, she's horribly scarred, burned, but when she's finally out of the hospital, she bumps into this guy. There are supposed to be no survivors. She was the sole survivor. Yet this guy's just fine and hanging around her. Now what? Now don't look to me for the answers because I have no idea.
Absolutely.
That's intriguing.
Yeah, that's the point, though. That's the story there. It's an idea that's going to bring out questions. And if you're starting to get a lot of questions about who is this and why would they do that, then you're engaged with your idea.
And when I do similar things, but with it I also teach the rule of three, which is your first three answers aren't going to count because those are the easily expected answers. And so if you want to find something really original, you're going to have to dig a little bit deeper and try and go far. So, what is it about the magazine? What's he reading? And the first three things that come to your mind are probably not what he's reading. So you've got to find something else, and that's going to add a little more originality to it. But and even more questions. And so questions beget questions. But it started with an image, right, of the plane going down, and everybody terrified except for one. And that's what we talked about earlier. Can you see it? That's the image that you want to really explore. So. I'm hoping that this was beneficial to your listeners as it has been for me. Molly, what does the room look like? Do we have questions, comments, concerns?
Just that we're all a bunch of nerds, basically. So,
okay.
But I embrace that. And they liked the idea of painting pictures with words. That part was great. Tess she made a comment about moshing of the ideas is a great place to start. And her current story that she's working on is a combination of Roman Holiday meets Bonanza. And that's what she says, and it's true because I'm in her critique group. So that's it's a good story. And
Little House of Prairie, except a little house on Mars.
Yeah.
Now that would be interesting.
If you think that's crazy, Ray Bradbury wrote a series of short stories that they put out as a novel, but it's a series of short stories, and you have some oddball characters who are colonizing Mars.
But
anyway, go ahead.
Close to what they're about to do, though, huh? That's about it. There's no questions unless anybody pops up within the next 30 seconds.
I did hear I had a mentor at Antioch that would say that he had taught a class at UCLA, and he said he had this really annoying student who during workshops would just dismiss everything in the most what's the word? He'd just objurgate everything. He'd criticize everything. He'd always boil everything down to two different things. It's Julius Caesar with monkeys, and throw the paper and just be a real jerk about it. And just kind of like, well, I don't know, Julius Caesar and monkeys, that could be interesting. What is that, Planet of the Apes? We could do a Planet of the Apes kind of a thing with that. Like, there's some ideas there that aren't awful, and Romeo and Juliet with fangs is not the worst idea I've ever heard. I'm not going to say that the book was fantastic, but there's some merit. to.
That's how they promote movies. When you pitch a movie, that's what you do. It's this plus this.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they like that, they'll ask more questions. So the joke I always use, it's Bambi meets Godzilla, Bambi wins.
Mm-hmm.
And that's called a big picture presentation.
There's a YouTube about that. There's a YouTube. Have you seen the Bambi versus Godzilla YouTube? Oh, I don't think Bambi wins though. So it's pretty dumb, but it's only like 30 seconds. The Hand of Adonai, Tron meets Narnia. That's kind of how I pitched it originally.
Star Trek is Wagon Train in space. Ray.
Yeah.
Somebody help me. Roddenberry. Yeah. He'd worked on
God rest his
things
soul.
And that's what Star Trek was. It was Wagon Train set in space.
Wow.
Absolutely. So, well, we are running out of time. It's strange to actually have a few minutes here at the end, but I feel like we've done a good job with the topic. We wanted to say thanks to everybody for joining us and listening in live, and those of you listening later on the podcast. We appreciate you guys as well. Don't be afraid to stop by and see us sometime. Digitally speaking is probably the best way on the Facebooks and the Tweeters. You can always find Pops at altongansky.com. Molly is at frankly.mydearmojo.com, and I'm at aarongansky.com. And we hope that you will join us next week as we talk about kicking the pig, getting it started. Well, you've got your idea, now we're going to put some words on page. What's the best way to do that? Don't forget to stop by and ask the author. You can do that on Facebook and Twitter as well. So until next week, we thank you all for listening, and good writing.